Hello, guys. Welcome to Fire and Wine, Theology and Other Things. Um, this is going to be a theological topic that has been brought up. I've been asked about it, and it has caused me over the years to have to dig into this passage to understand this passage. And you're probably going to say, "I've never heard this before," and if it's something you've never heard, there might be a lot of questions around it. This is why I left you with the source materials so that you can read them yourself. So I'm going to do my best to keep this not too long. And so I may not quote a bunch from the source materials. I'm probably going to summarize a lot of what they say. And something you need to know is this has some adult themes in it. So if you've got children around, you just need to be aware that there are some adult themes in this subject because we're going to be addressing the context and the time and what Paul may have been referring to. Let's get started. And we got to get started because there's a lot to get to. Okay, so just to start out with, if you've ever read the passage, you'll get familiar with the passage by just reading 16 verses. In those 16 verses, the essential summarization is Paul explains. Paul explains basically, God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of every man. Husband is the head of the wife. If a woman does not cover her head when she prays and prophesies, if she does not cover her head, she is dishonoring her head, referring to her husband. Okay? Now this would fit nice and neatly in what we know about the first century culture in this region, because women did not go around without their head fully covered with a veil. And I'm not just talking about the Jewish culture, I'm talking about the Greek culture in this time. Okay. And there's a lot of resources out there you can look up about how women dressed in this time. Okay. And we have to understand this. We have to know this because we have to understand, is Paul referring to what we're dealing with today? Yes and no. Because what they dealt with in as far as modesty and immodesty in that time was different than what we deal with in modesty and immodesty today. But we can still apply the passage to what we deal with today. Now, here's the backdrop, okay? First and foremost, and we'll get to verse 15 because this verse, everything hinges upon this verse. And when I say this verse, you'll know what I'm talking about, okay? No women went publicly without a full veil covering of all their hair. There was an exception. Prostitutes would remove their veil to show their sexual availability. This happened a lot in temple prostitution during prophecy. Okay? So you'll see maybe why Paul is saying if you're going to speak in terms of speaking on behalf of God, because that's what prophecy is. People say, is it fortune telling? It's not fortune telling. Is it foretelling? Is it forthtelling? Listen, prophecy is simply this: speaking on behalf of God, okay? You're speaking the heart of God, you're speaking what God is saying. So we know that this is what is referencing in this passage. There's a spiritual movement, but if the wives are going to operate in this spiritual movement, they need to not put their husbands in a shameful place, okay? And we need to understand why this would be the case, okay? So at the very end of the passage, verse 15, this statement is made, and this is where there's confusion, okay? It says, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. It's her glory, specifically for her, okay? For her hair is given to her for and this is the confusion, a covering, or we can say a veil or something. Basically, Paul is making the statement, she needs to cover her head, but don't worry, because if she has hair, that's enough. Now, I'm just going to tell you this right now. If this is what that Greek word means, that word there, covering, then we have just dismissed the first 14 verses of what Paul's trying to say and the culturally specific moment that Paul is in, which is basically the hair isn't enough. In that time, they covered up, okay, because of what and we'll get to the scientific community, but what Paul knows about the scientific and medical community of the time. The context is, the belief is that hair in the first century was seen not just as something long or beautiful, or something women put up or put down, or whatever the case is. They believed the hair was a sexual organ. Now, I'm about to make my case here. Okay, so Paul is using this term. He says, does not nature itself. Now, I'm going to jump back and forth in this passage, okay? And the reason is because a lot of you know the passage. Just read the passage, read it all the way through, and then we'll try to understand it. Because I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. He says, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? Okay? That's what he believed nature was teaching. Now, when Paul refers to nature, what is he referring to? Now, here's a belief. Paul uses the term nature. Paul is referencing the scientific and medical literature to inform the reader of why men have short hair and why women have long hair. Okay? Although the scientific literature and medical literature at the time was wrong, and we'll get into what the medical literature said, Paul was reminding his readers of customary practices that they need to go by and understand, so that they do not become an offense. Okay, so that they don't shame their husband. Now, here's the deal. Hippocrates, you know this person, you know the name, because this is where the term Hippocratic oath comes from. Hippocrates was the leader of the medical community at the time. He informed doctors and scientists of that time. The belief was, now again, we know this is wrong. He's physiologically wrong, but it's what they believed. That women, in their hair was their fertility. Okay, when their hair was cut short, they were less fertile. This is why Paul says in, I believe it's verse 6, that if she cuts her hair off or shaves it, it's a shame. It's because it was a public shame. It's a public shame to be barren, right? In that time, and now it isn't today, but in that time, it was a public shame to be barren, to not be fertile. Okay, well, they believed that the hair was uh, where the fertility was. Okay, and when you read the source materials, you understand this. Hippocrates taught that the longer the hair, that the more fertility was in that hair, the more that it would basically absorb or bring forth the male semen to the egg and therefore produce a child. Okay, so this is what they believed. They believed that women's hair was part of their sexuality. Okay, this is one of the reasons why they felt so strongly about covering it up. Now, why would we have a passage here that states that women's hair is given to them for and we have the word covering, when in fact they were to cover their hair, especially in a public worship setting? Because, now I'm going to read you this. This word for covering, we do not have another reference in the New Testament of it. It's the Greek word parabole. Okay? We don't have any other passage in the New Testament that states the meaning of this word. It is on its own. It is a unique word. And if you Googled it, you would not get a definition, as far as like, if you put it in Google Translate, you're not going to get a definition. Because the only thing that informs the Greek word here, and unfortunately, what we have in translations, we have a lot of translations that go, well, they translated it this, and we're just going to kind of keep it there. But as time goes on, we learn more, we get more resources, and then we begin to tie in more culturally specific, contextual things that help us understand the word. The word is parabole. Now, I'm going to read you something, and you're going to have to you're going to have to dig into the source materials, because this is going to blow your mind. What informs, what's a good way of uh, finding this Greek word? Well, there's a lot of literature in the time of in this time period. Okay, there's a lot of literature out there um, that would inform us of what this Greek word means. The hair is given to her for the word is parabole. Okay, so here's one place we find this Greek word. Now, I'm going to read to you from the source material that is, hold on, let me get his name here so I don't get it wrong. It is from Troy W. Martin, and he's saying Paul's argument from nature for the veil. Okay? Now, I'm going to read you directly from this. This is a quote. Since parabole is contrasted with hair, which is part of the body, the physiological semantic domain of parabole in 1 Corinthians 11:15 becomes particularly relevant. Euripides, okay, writes, uses parabole in reference to a body part. He casts Hercules, you know Hercules, so in some of the literature about Hercules, he casts Hercules as complaining. After I received my bags of flesh, which are an outward sign of puberty, I received labors about which I shall undertake to say what is necessary. A dynamic translation of the first clause would be, after I received my testicles. Parabole. He is literally saying the Greek word parabole is testicles, which are the outward signs of puberty. Unquote. In the text Euripides, the term parabole refers to a testicle. Now, this would tie in to first century literature to state that the belief was that women's hair was a sexual organ and needed to be covered. Now, physiologically, we don't believe this. But what is Paul doing? Paul is doing what Paul always does. Do not let your good be spoken evil of. You may be in liberty. You may be able to do things. But listen, you don't want people coming up and mixing us up with a temple of, name the Greek god or goddess, right? Temple prostitution, removing the veil, prophesying using demonic spirits. We do not want people confusing us with them, nor do we want to bring shame on our husbands. Why is it so important? Why did Paul make this? Paul believed in marriage. Okay? Paul is establishing a position to say, hey, if you are going to pray or prophesy with your hair uncovered, your head uncovered, you are going to be dishonoring your husbands. Okay? And the reason is we know this. If we read the book of Proverbs, we know that there's a couple kind of women you don't want to be married to. One of which is a nagging wife, and the other one is a flirt. Okay, and this is why Paul is explaining specifically that you want, and this is what we know culturally. If a woman went out with her hair uncovered, that she would show herself as sexually available. And this also informs another passage, and we'll touch on that passage about a symbol of authority because of the angels. Okay. Um, Now I'm gonna make this a stronger case in just a second of why I believe that a woman's hair. So why would a woman need to be covered? Because her hair is her glory, and it is given to her for a testicle. Now, this is a statement that basically says your hair is given to you for a sexual organ. Your hair is given to you because and it's not that Paul is saying, I believe this, I stand by this. He is saying that does not nature teach you? He is making a statement of what the medical and scientific community is stating and why the people in the church need to do it. Okay? It would be the same thing that we do in our culture. It's not just now, listen, Paul, I don't know what Paul did or didn't believe about what Hippocrates taught. Okay, the point being is that Paul is recommend. He's not making a recommendation. He's making a statement about customs and traditions in the church that they need to uphold so that they do not offend, for one, the community around them, and that people don't confuse them with other temples and worshiping of other deities. Okay, um, So, a couple things here that help tie into this. Now, I'm going to make my case a little bit stronger because there's another statement, another finding in literature that's a little bit more graphic, but I think it will help you understand the belief. Now, the time period was very sexually promiscuous. The whole time period was there. We just know we know the first century was they were crazy in that time, and maybe they draw into a little bit more of what we deal with today. Maybe we don't even recognize how much we are like the times in the first century. Um, but Paul makes a statement. He says, "For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair off." So he's making a statement. Say, listen, if you don't want to cover your hair, then just cut your hair. Okay. And then he goes on to say, but since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Now listen, this actually really informs now what we know. If we believe that the word means that her hair is her fertility, then of course cutting her hair, of course shaving her head would be a public shame. And it was a public shame because women, fertility was, for the most part, being as a woman, that was a big part. Now we may not believe that today, but they did believe that then. Okay. And so they would make the statement that since it's a shame to do that, then just cover your hair. Okay. Um, and obviously, it goes on to talk about how men don't do that. There's a difference between being masculine and feminine, and men don't do that. And that was not the culture at the time. And men did not have long hair. And it was a public shame for them to have long hair because it was more feminine. Okay. So maybe we can understand a few things here that this would inform the reader. Okay. This would also inform us that specifically in the first century, that it was considered effeminate to have long hair as a man. And men did not do it. It was a shame, right? Um, so I'm going to make a little bit stronger case. I'm going to do my best to state these words, but this again is in the source materials. I'm making a direct quote here. Achilles Tatius plays on this meaning of parabole in his erotic description of a garden in which Clitophon seeks an amorous encounter with Leucippe. Now, Achilles Tatius describes the entwinings of flowers, embracings of leaves, and intercourses of the fruits. Okay, now this is the terms they use. This is a little bit more graphic, but I think this is going to make the point. Okay, the term paraplokoi alludes to the female hair. Okay, the term parabole to the testicle in the males. Okay, now his description of this garden associates female hair and the testicles of males. Again, if we want to understand this passage, we have to be okay with saying we've not seen this Greek word, but we do see it in other literature that was in this time and in the Greek language. Now, here's the deal. Here's what we have to get and understand about the passage. Informed by this tradition, Paul appropriately instructs women in the service of God to cover their hair since it is part of the female genitalia. Now I'm quoting directly from Troy Martin here, so this is not me stating, this is him. According to Paul's argument, women may pray or prophesy in public worship along with men, but only when both are decently attired, even though no contemporary person would agree with the physiological conceptions informing Paul's argument from nature for the veiling of women. Everyone would agree with his conclusion prohibiting the display of genitalia in public worship, since the physiological conceptions of the body have changed. However, no physiological reason remains for continuing the practice of covering women's head in public worship, and many Christian communities reasonably abandon this practice. Okay, so today, in today's age, people are going to come into a church in a public gathering, and they're going to see women who are not veiled, and they're not going to confuse the worship of Jesus with the worship of Zeus. Okay, they're not going to confuse it because we don't believe this about women's hair, because we do have some science behind us now. Okay, but because of now we have to understand what Paul is doing. And this is how all of this stuff works when it comes to reading the scriptures. We have to be informed by the context and apply it appropriately. So, how do we apply it appropriately? I've got a couple keys here I think will help us. Um, okay, a group of women who decided, they're married women, decided this Sunday we're going to go in bikinis to church on Sunday. We're going to pray and we're going to prophesy publicly. They might bring some shame on their husbands. Might. Right? Am I right? Why? Because marriage is so important. This is all over the scriptures. Listen, if you have an angry man or a flirtatious husband, right, he brings dishonor to his wife, right? If you have a flirtatious wife or a contentious wife or a nagging wife, it brings dishonor to her husband, right? Paul is Paul is constantly, especially in Corinthians, he's trying to bring the union back of the wife and the husband. Okay, and this is so important that to apply it, we have to say, hey, Paul is trying to establish something in the church. Now, Paul deals with different things we deal with. Okay, example, we don't deal with indentured servanthood or indentured slavery, right, today. And by the way, if you don't know that when Paul references slave, that's a little bit different because slaves, what we know of slavery is different than what they knew of slavery. They were referring to indentured servanthood. A lot of that servants also were able to have servants of their own. They were able to build wealth. They were able to work off their debts. There was a lot of things that happened in this that are very different than what we deal with today. It would be closer to, and I'm not saying exactly like having a butler, but kind of similar to, okay, similar to somebody who doesn't have the ability to bring in their own resources, but has to be basically kind of a servant to someone else. Okay, it was a little bit different, although there was obviously um, some some bondage to the context of that. I'm trying to use my words right. So Paul is dealing with that. We don't deal with that today, not in America at least. So those things inform what he's teaching, just like this context does as well. So we have to recognize that when we are dealing with something like this, um, we got to understand. Yes, there's freedom, but there's also understanding. Like, don't let your good be spoken evil of, right? If there's some liberties that you have, you're not supposed to just whatever. You got to understand how people may perceive you. They may perceive you as weird or promiscuous or off or whatever the case is. And you're like, we're just doing our own thing. Well, how will people perceive that? And there's part of that there's a balance there, but still you have to. It's not a bad thing to err on the side of limiting your freedoms to broaden your ability to help minister and persuade people into the gospel. Okay, so there's one passage that may bring a little bit confusion, and one I want to say this. I think it's pretty crystal clear that Paul is making a statement that women can pray and prophesy. The word prophecy here, I believe, means speaking on behalf of God. So I think it refers to a public speaking, public gathering, and public speaking on behalf of God. So it's hard to, I mean, we see other contexts where it literally refers to women prophets. We know that Philip's daughters were prophetesses. Um, we see a lot of women who are in positionally some form of leadership in the church or some form of being able to teach, right? We see Priscilla. We see her leading. She leads with her husband. So I just don't make it too complicated. There are other passages I think we can get into another time about women preaching and women speaking and women leading. And I happen to err on the side of women being able to prophesy, preach, etc., etc. But I also really feel like it's important that when we understand this passage, Paul is saying, listen, if you're going to do it, just realize that you are also a representation in your household. And the same goes for men, by the way. But I think Paul was trying to address a specific issue. Um, But here's a very confusing passage. A lot of people are confused by it. It says um, that a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And that's in verse 10. Now, why would Paul reference the angels? Now, a lot of people believe that, oh, well, I, some people believe in the tradition that if a woman has long hair, that it gives her some authority or power with angels. It doesn't say that she gives authority or power with angels. Um, authority doesn't, authority, scripturally speaking, comes only by through the grace and blood of Jesus Christ. Like Jesus cleanses us, and um, he he basically communicates to us, hey, um, the spiritual authority comes through the Holy Spirit. There isn't this thing where I have extra authority because now I have angels. I don't believe that's what the Scripture teaches. Um, this is about a symbol of authority on her head. So she has a symbol of authority. What's that symbol of authority? Well, it would speak to the early verses when it talks about how she is basically submitting to her husband, who is her head. Head, the Greek word kephale, is referring to the source, right? God is the source of Christ. Christ is the source of every man. And husband is the source of his wife, meaning that she comes directly from him. This does not mean that um, she is not equal. That this doesn't mean that she is not how should I say corresponding authority with him. This means that the Bible does say she submits to him. It means he is the main prior he's priority in leadership. Okay, so he makes a leadership role, but it does say that because of this, she has a symbol on her head that she is under authority. Okay, because of the angels. Now, this is important. I believe this taps into Genesis chapter 6, where it talks about these angels, sons of God, who came in the daughters of men, and basically seduced these women. These women bore, the Bible calls them Nephilim uh, later on, Rephaim, Anakim. Like there's a lot of information on this. Essentially, there were giants created. The Bible may call them men of renown. It was a very perverse moment. God saw it, and it's what initiated the flood. Um, there's references. Peter in the Bible references this, directly references it, and says these angels left their natural estate, and it was the equivalent of perversion that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. Jude refers to it. It says these angels are kept in darkness. I believe this always informed the New Testament writers. And so this is something we have to understand. Now, this is something that I did leave some source material for you. I will have to make another video about, but I believe it is a way to establish the belief system in the Second Temple period, a term used by Michael Heiser. I recommend the book. Uh, uh, well, all the books from Michael Heiser, but more specifically, what's that book? It's called um, what is that book called? Um, just a second. Um, well, anyway, there's a lot of books. Okay, Michael Heiser. Look up Michael Heiser. Um, I can't remember the name of the book I want to recommend to you, but look up Michael S. Heiser. God rest his soul. He passed away not too long ago. But he will really inform you on this and why this is so important. But look at my source materials, and you'll understand. A lot of people in the Second Temple period believe that there were essentially two falls. One was the man, when man fell and they ate of the tree, knowledge of good and evil, and the second fall was right before Noah, when the door of perversion was opened into our world through these angels who sinned. Now, that's what the Bible says. These angels who sinned, who are now kept in chains. And so this symbol of authority is a reminder that these particular women in the service, that they are kept for their husbands, right? They're kept for their husbands. This is important. This is important. Sexual purity is a huge deal in the church, and we need to recognize it as so. And I think this informs us. I'm using that word informs us because I believe that this context helps us understand this passage. And so I hope that helps. If you like the materials that I'm bringing to you, this is one of those where I go into a theological thing. Some of the stuff I do is it's not entirely like a deep dive into a theological topic. It's more applicable, but this is one of those moments where I want to answer some questions. And so I hope this helps, and I hope that you can recognize this, and I hope this doesn't freak you out too much. But I wish you blessings, and enjoy the videos. Blessing. Bye bye.